From the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Hungary, the Mongol Empire had never retreated, never failed, never stopped. Until it did for a reason Europe would not discover for years. Picture the spring of 1242. The Kingdom of Hungary lay in ruins, its fields scorched, its villages emptied, its military power shattered in a single catastrophic battle. For nearly a year, Mongol armies had ravaged Central Europe with a speed and ferocity that left chroniclers struggling for words adequate to the horror. Kings and princes across Christendom braced for the inevitable, the continuation of a conquest that had already devoured empires from China to the Caspian Sea. Then, without warning, the Mongols withdrew. They packed their camps, turned their horses eastward, and vanished back across the steppes, leaving behind a traumatized continent and a question that would haunt historians for centuries. Why? What could possibly turn back the most fearsome military force the world had ever seen? European chroniclers attributed it to divine intervention, to the prayers of the faithful, to the intercession of saints. Some claimed the Mongols had been defeated, driven back by Christian valour. Others whispered that the invaders had found Europe too poor, too forested, too difficult to conquer. All of them were wrong. The truth is at once more mundane and more profound. Europe's salvation came not from anything Europeans did, but from an event that occurred thousands of miles away in the Mongol capital of Karakorum. An event that reveals just how fragile the thread upon which Western civilization hung in those desperate months. This is one of history's greatest what-if moments, a hinge point where the trajectory of human civilization turned on circumstances beyond any European's control or even awareness. Today we will examine the Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241, the devastating Battle of Mohi, the subsequent rampage across Central Europe, and the shocking withdrawal that followed. More importantly, we will uncover the real reason why the Mongols left, and why that reason should make us reconsider everything we think we know about historical inevitability. To understand what descended upon Europe, we must first grasp what the Mongol Empire had become by 1240. Under Ögedei Khan, third son of Genghis and inheritor of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, the Mongol war machine had refined conquest into something approaching an exact science. Ögedei lacked his father's mythic charisma and raw ambition, but he possessed something perhaps more dangerous: administrative competence and the wisdom to delegate military campaigns to those who excelled at violence. Where Genghis had been the visionary conqueror, Ögedei proved the capable steward, and under stewards, empires expand through momentum as much as design. By 1240, that momentum had already consumed the Khwarezmian Empire in a campaign of such thoroughness that entire cities vanished from maps. The Rus principalities had fallen in a winter campaign between 1237 and 1240 that demonstrated a tactical sophistication European commanders could scarcely imagine. Coordinated armies moving across frozen rivers, striking multiple cities simultaneously, turning the season that should have protected the defenders into their greatest vulnerability. Leading this western expansion stood two men whose partnership would prove devastating. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis and prince of the royal bloodline, provided the political authority and dynastic legitimacy. But the true architect of what was to come was Subutai, a general whose career spanned 65 years and whose record remained unblemished by a single strategic defeat. To call Subutai the greatest general in history might seem hyperbole until one considers the evidence. He commanded campaigns across more territory than any commander before or since, adapted to every terrain and opponent, and never lost. Not once. Alexander conquered the known world in a decade. Subutai spent 6 decades doing it across a larger canvas. Hungary had drawn Mongol attention for reasons both strategic and personal. King Bela IV had granted refuge to the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people fleeing westward before the Mongol advance. To the Mongols, this represented both an insult and a security threat. Enemies sheltered became enemies to pursue. But Hungary offered more than a target for retribution. It served as the gateway to the rest of Europe, a fertile plain accessible through the Carpathian passes, blessed with resources and cursed with a geographic position that made it the inevitable first victim of any steppe invasion heading west. The force that gathered for the invasion numbered between 20,000 and 40,000 warriors. Estimates vary, but even the lower figure represented an army of terrifying capability. Each warrior brought multiple horses, composite bows of greater range and power than European, weapons and experience in campaigns that had toppled empires. How could medieval Europe, fragmented into squabbling kingdoms and principalities, hope to stop such a force? With preparations complete, the storm was ready to break upon Europe. The invasion began in the depths of winter, when European armies traditionally sheltered in their castles and waited for campaigning season. The Mongols recognized no such calendar. In early 1241, multiple columns pierced the Carpathian mountain barrier simultaneously, one through the northern passes toward Poland, others driving directly into Hungary from the east and northeast. This coordination alone should have terrified European observers. Medieval kingdoms struggled to move a single army from one province to another. The Mongols synchronized multiple forces across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain, timing their emergence into Hungarian lands to maximize chaos and prevent any unified response. The outlying regions died first. Mongol. Advance forces swept through border settlements with methodical brutality, and the brutality served a purpose beyond mere cruelty. Survivors fled westward, carrying stories of inhuman savagery, of cities burned and populations slaughtered. These refugees clogged the roads, consumed supplies, and spread panic far more effectively than any army could by force of arms alone. Terror, weaponized and directed, became the vanguard of the invasion. King Bellathor understood the threat. He issued urgent calls for his nobility to muster their forces, sent desperate appeals to neighbouring kingdoms, and attempted to rally every available warrior to the defence of his realm. But even as he gathered his army, the foundation of that defence crumbled from within. The Cumans, those same refugees whose flight from Mongol conquest had helped provoke this invasion, now found themselves suspects in their sanctuary. Whispers spread through the Hungarian camp. Were the Cumans spies? Had they led the enemy, here deliberately? When a mob murdered Curtin, the Cuman Khan, the alliance shattered. The Cumans departed, and in their fury at this betrayal, they plundered Hungarian lands on their way south toward the Balkans. This internal collapse doomed Hungary before a single decisive battle was fought. Bela had lost thousands of capable horse archers, whose fighting style might have offered some counter to Mongol tactics, and he had demonstrated to his own people and nobility that the kingdom could tear itself apart under pressure. Unity, that most precious resource in warfare, had evaporated precisely when it was needed most. Meanwhile, the Mongol columns converged with unnerving precision. Batu Khan's forces advanced from the northeast, while other detachments swept through Transylvania and crossed the southern Carpathians. Hungarian armies sent to intercept them discovered the maddening reality of fighting steppe warriors. The Mongols refused to engage on European terms. They retreated. When pressed, lured pursuers into exhaustion, then wheeled and struck when advantage shifted. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to stand and accept battle, who turns warfare into a hunt where you are always the prey? By early April, the various Mongol columns had achieved their strategic convergence in northeastern Hungary. Bela's army, perhaps 15,000 strong, and reinforced by a small contingent of Knights Templar, marched to confront them. The Hungarians established camp near the Sajo River with our Mongol forces positioned across the water. A stone bridge offered the only obvious crossing point, and both armies knew that whoever controlled that bridge controlled the battle to come. By early April 1241, the decisive confrontation could no longer be avoided. The Hungarian camp sprawled across the plain west of the Sajo River, a sea of tents housing perhaps 15,000 warriors who believed themselves the defenders of Christendom. They had marched to meet the Mongol threat. They had taken position, and they held the western bank while the enemy remained on the far side of the water. The stone bridge between them seemed to offer a natural choke point. Any Mongol assault would have to funnel across that narrow span directly into Hungarian steel. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 11th, Bela's commanders likely felt something approaching confidence. They should have felt dread. Overconfidence kills as surely as any sword. The Hungarians had positioned themselves in what appeared to be a strong defensive stance, but they had committed a fatal error. They had crowded their entire force into a single camp with inadequate space and no clear plan for rapid deployment. When fighting an enemy whose defining characteristic is speed, immobility becomes suicide. Just before dawn, Mongol forces under Batu Khan's direct command assaulted the stone bridge. Contemporary accounts describe a fierce struggle as Hungarian defenders rushed to hold the crossing against what appeared to be the main Mongol attack. The bridge became a killing ground, bodies piling upon stone as the Hungarians committed more and more of their strength to holding this obvious avenue of approach. It seemed to be working. The Mongols could not force the passage. But this was never the main attack. It was a diversion, and the Hungarians were buying into it with every warrior they sent to reinforce that bloody span. Miles to the south, Subutai had already found a ford and crossed the river with a substantial force. The old general understood what European commanders did not. Battles are won by position and manoeuvre long before the actual fighting begins. While Hungarian attention fixated on the bridge, Mongol cavalry swept around to strike the camp from the south. This was one of history's most perfectly executed double envelopments, not through overwhelming numbers but through exploiting an opponent's fixed assumptions about how battles should unfold. The Hungarians expected a frontal assault because that was what European warfare looked like. They received instead a lesson in operational art that would not be matched in Western military practice until the age of Napoleon. The Hungarian camp dissolved into chaos. Warriors scrambling to form ranks found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Mongol composite bows, effective at ranges far beyond European weapons, turned the camp into an abattoir before the fighting even reached close quarters. The Hungarians attempted to form defensive positions, but they were packed too tightly, their cavalry unable to manoeuvre, their formations disrupted by the camp's own layout. What should have been a defensive advantage, the massed strength of the entire Hungarian army, became a death trap. Then the Mongols did something that appeared to make no sense. They opened a gap in their encirclement, leaving a clear route of escape to the west. Panicked, bloodied, and watching their defensive cohesion disintegrate, Hungarian warriors began to flee through that opening. Was this mercy, or the cruelest tactic of all? It was murder disguised as escape. Once the Hungarian army abandoned its defensive position and broke into a rout, Mongol-like cavalry pursued with the patience of hunters culling a herd. The slaughter extended for miles across the Hungarian plain as exhausted men on foot or on tired horses found themselves run down by mounted archers on fresh steppe ponies. Medieval chroniclers, never squeamish about describing battlefield carnage, struggled to convey the scale. Estimates suggest 10,000 to 20,000 Hungarians died in the battle and pursuit, perhaps two-thirds of Bela's army obliterated in a single day. The Battle of Mohi stands as the definitive refutation of medieval European military practice. The Hungarians had fought with courage, had fielded experienced warriors including contingents of elite Templar knights, and had chosen defensible ground. None of it mattered against an opponent operating on a different level of tactical sophistication entirely. The Mongols possessed superior equipment, wielded superior tactics, demonstrated superior operational planning, and employed siege technology that could break defensive formations before cavalry even closed to contact. King Bela IV fled the field and spent the following months as a fugitive in his own disintegrating kingdom. The Mongols pursued him relentlessly, turning his flight into a humiliation that undermined any hope of rallying further resistance. Behind him, Hungary lay defenceless. In a single day, the military power of Hungary was shattered. With Hungary broken, nothing stood between the Mongols and Western Europe. What followed Mohi was not mere conquest. it was systematic erasure. Across the Hungarian plain, Mongol columns spread like a methodical plague, reducing settlements to ash and memory. Population estimates remain disputed, but the most conservative assessments suggest that between 15 and 25% of Hungary's people perished in the months following the battle. To put that in perspective, the Black Death a century later would kill roughly a third of Europe's population over several years. The Mongols achieved comparable devastation in a single kingdom in a single campaigning season. Was this vengeance for harbouring the Cumans, or was it something colder and more calculated, strategic depopulation designed to transform Hungary into a secure base for further operations? The Mongols had demonstrated in previous campaigns that they understood demographic warfare, that they could deliberately empty regions to serve military purposes. The thoroughness of Hungary's destruction suggests intention beyond rage. Bela, meanwhile, fled westward and then south, a king reduced to refugee. The Mongols pursued him all the way to the Dalmatian coast, through Croatia and down to the Adriatic islands, where he finally found temporary sanctuary. Even in exile, his kingdom burning behind him, Bela served a purpose for the Mongols. His flight advertised their reach, demonstrated that nowhere offered safety, that crowns and titles meant nothing before their advance. But the most ominous developments occurred at the edges of the conquest. Mongol detachments probed westward into Austria, southward into the Balkans, and conducted reconnaissance toward northern Italy. These were not raids. They were scouting missions for the 1242 campaign, the gathering of intelligence about roads, defences, and the location of resources. Duke Frederick II of Austria managed a small victory against one of these probing forces, a minor engagement that Europeans celebrated with disproportionate enthusiasm because victories of any kind had become so rare. It changed nothing strategically, but offered a sliver of hope that the Mongols might be mortal after all. Across Western Europe, panic spread faster than any army could march. Papal legates attempted to organise a coordinated response, but coordination required trust and unity that competing kingdoms could not manufacture even facing existential threat. Where would the Mongols strike when campaigning season returned? Austria seemed obvious, but would they drive toward the wealthy cities of northern Italy? Might they push through the Balkans toward Constantinople? Perhaps they would simply march west through Bavaria toward France, absorbing kingdoms as they went. As autumn arrived, the Mongol armies settled into winter quarters across devastated Hungary, their horses grazing on Hungarian grass, their warriors resting and preparing for the spring offensive that would decide the fate of Western Christendom. Then, as winter gave way to spring, the unthinkable occurred. In the spring of 1242, Mongol armies that had spent the winter consolidating their hold on Hungary began to move, not westward into Austria or Italy, but eastward, back toward the steppes from which they had come. Camps were struck, supply trains organised, and the entire invasion force retreated across the Carpathians with the same eerie coordination that had characterised their arrival. Within weeks, Central Europe stood empty of the conquerors, who had seemed poised to devour the continent. European chroniclers recorded this withdrawal with a confusion bordering on incomprehension. Master Roger, who had survived the devastation and whose Carmen Miserabile stands as one of the most harrowing eyewitness accounts of the invasion, could offer no explanation for why the terror had suddenly ceased. Thomas of Split and other contemporary writers groped for answers that made sense within their worldview. Had God intervened? Had Europe's prayers been answered? Had the Virgin Mary herself appeared to turn back the heathen horde? Perhaps the relics carried in desperate processions had worked their promised miracles after all. Some claimed, and continued to claim for decades afterward, that the Mongols had been defeated in battle, that Christian warriors had finally found the measure of these invaders and driven them back. This was fantasy masquerading as comfort. Others suggested that the Mongols had reconsidered their invasion upon seeing the poverty of European lands, or that the forests and castles of the West had proven too formidable. These theories shared a common thread. They credited European agency, European geography, European resistance with achieving what European arms manifestly had not. The mystery persisted for centuries. Historians debated, competing theories assembled fragmentary evidence, constructed elaborate explanations for why the most successful military force in medieval history had voluntarily abandoned a conquest that appeared all but complete. Europeans wanted to believe they had been saved by something they had done, some quality of their civilization or faith that had proven proof against the Mongol advance. But history is less flattering than myth. Europe had done nothing to save itself because Europe had nothing left with which to mount meaningful resistance. The answer lay not in anything Europe had done, but in an event that transpired in Karakorum. On December 11th, 1241, while Mongol armies settled into their winter quarters across the ruins of Hungary, Ögedei Khan died in Karakorum. The great Khan of the Mongol Empire, ruler of territories stretching from Korea to Poland, third son of Genghis Khan and architect of the empire's administrative consolidation, likely succumbed to the effects of chronic alcoholism. Contemporary sources suggest he had long struggled with drinking, and despite interventions by advisors who understood the danger, he could not or would not moderate his consumption. The irony should make us pause. A drinking habit, a personal vice, a failure of moderation, may have saved Western civilization. Not European valour, not defensive brilliance, not divine intervention, but the inability of one man to control his thirst for wine. History textbooks prefer grand explanations, sweeping forces, the clash of civilizations. Sometimes the hinge of human events is embarrassingly small. But the death itself mattered less than what it triggered. The Mongol Empire operated under a succession system called the Kurultai, a gathering of princes and generals who would elect the next great Khan from among the descendants of Genghis. This was not a formality or a ceremonial rubber stamp. It was a political crucible, where claims were pressed, alliances formed and broken, and the future direction of the empire decided. And Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return to Mongolia to participate. Ögedei had not designated a clear heir. His preferred son had predeceased him, leaving a power vacuum surrounded by ambitious claimants. Guyuk, Ögedei's eldest surviving son, had a claim by direct lineage, but Batu Khan, leading the European campaign, was the senior prince of the family line and wielded enormous military prestige. Other princes harboured their own ambitions, saw their own paths to supremacy. The stage was set for a succession crisis that could tear the empire apart if not managed carefully. Here we encounter the paradox at the heart of Mongol success. The same political discipline that had built the largest land empire in history now constrained it. The Mongols had created a system that prevented the kind of immediate civil war that destroyed most conquering dynasties, but only by requiring all major players to participate in orderly succession. That requirement meant armies had to stop, generals had to return, conquests had to pause. The system that prevented chaos also prevented the completion of the European campaign. For Batu and the other princes commanding armies in Hungary, the calculation was brutally simple. What is a kingdom in Europe worth compared to the throne of the entire Mongol Empire? What value did Vienna or Paris hold against the possibility of ruling from the Pacific to the Mediterranean? They could complete the conquest of Europe and return to find the succession decided without them, their rivals entrenched, their own claims marginalised or eliminated. Or they could abandon the campaign and race back to secure their political futures. The distance made the choice even clearer. From Hungary to Karakorum stretched more than 4,000 miles of steppe, mountain and desert, months of hard travel even for mounted warriors. Every week spent in Europe was a week their competitors could use to build coalitions, distribute largesse, and consolidate support. The withdrawal order likely reached the commanders sometime in early 1242, and the armies began their eastward march shortly thereafter. This was not unprecedented. Just as the death of Genghis Khan had halted campaigns in Persia 2 decades earlier, so the death of Ögedei froze the Western advance. The pattern revealed a fundamental limitation of the empire. It could expand only as long as internal politics remained stable. When succession came into question, external conquest became impossible to sustain, regardless of military advantage. Modern historians have reached near universal consensus on this explanation. The withdrawal was not defeat, not strategic reconsideration, not a response to European resistance. It was a political necessity driven by the internal logic of Mongol governance. The evidence from both Eastern and Western sources aligns. Ögedei died in December 1241, the armies withdrew in spring 1242, and the timing corresponds exactly to how long news would take to travel from Karakorum to Hungary and for withdrawal to be organised. One man's death changed the course of Western history more profoundly than any battle Europe might have fought. Yet some have argued other factors played a role. Over the centuries, historians reluctant to credit a single death with such enormous consequences have proposed alternative explanations. Each deserves examination, if only to understand why they fall short. The first theory suggests that the Mongols had suffered heavier casualties than sources indicate, that Mohi and the subsequent campaigns had bled their armies to a point where continuing westward became impractical. The evidence contradicts this entirely. Mongol losses at Mohi were minimal. The battle had been a nearly perfect tactical execution, not a costly slugging match. Contemporary accounts describe Hungarian devastation, but make no mention of Mongol forces depleted or struggling. When an army retreats due to casualties, it limps home in disarray. The Mongols withdrew in organised columns with their command structure intact. This was not the movement of a broken force. A second theory points to Hungarian partisan resistance, to the guerrilla warfare that developed in the occupied territories as survivors took to forests and mountains to continue fighting. This resistance was real and it was courageous, but it was not strategically decisive. The Mongols had faced similar resistance in Rus, in Persia, in every territory they had conquered. They possessed proven methods for suppressing insurgencies, patience, brutality, and the systematic reduction of areas that harboured resistance. Partisan warfare could delay consolidation, inflict casualties on occupation forces, and preserve seeds of future rebellion. But it had never stopped a Mongol conquest. It slowed them in Hungary. It did not turn them back. The third theory claims that European terrain posed insurmountable challenges, that the forests and castles of Central and Western Europe represented obstacles the Mongols could not overcome. This argument collapses under the weight of Mongol military history. Did the Mongols, who conquered from frozen Siberia to tropical Indochina, who reduced the fortified cities of China and Persia, who adapted to every environment and opponent they encountered, really fear European forests? They had already developed sophisticated siege warfare, catapults, covered assault equipment, engineering corps capable of constructing siege works. European castles were formidable, but so were Chinese walled cities, and those had fallen with grim regularity. The terrain argument treats the Mongols as a one-dimensional force incapable of adaptation, which is precisely the opposite of what made them so dangerous. Some historians have suggested the withdrawal represented not retreat, but strategic pause, a planned consolidation before the next phase of expansion. This might be credible if the Mongols had ever returned with comparable force, but they never did. The Golden Horde would maintain presence in Eastern Europe, but the era of major westward campaigns effectively ended with the 1242 withdrawal. Finally, there is the Austrian victory, celebrated at the time as proof that Mongols could be beaten. It was too small, too isolated, too tactically insignificant to matter. Single skirmish does not reverse the momentum of continental conquest. While these factors may have influenced timing or shaped strategic calculations at the margins, none explain the complete withdrawal. None account for why the Mongols abandoned not just Austria or Italy, but Hungary itself, territory they had already conquered and occupied. The Kurultai was the decisive factor, the only explanation that accounts for the totality and suddenness of the retreat. To understand why this mattered so much, we must grasp what Europe faced. European knights facing Mongol armies experienced something akin to travelling backward in time and confronting warriors from their own future. The technological and tactical gap was that severe. Begin with the composite bow, that masterpiece of steppe engineering, layers of wood, horn and sinew, compressed and bound to create a weapon that could pierce armour at ranges where European bows were barely effective. A Mongol warrior could loose arrows accurately from horseback at full gallop, a skill European cavalry never mastered because they never needed to. Their warfare centred on the shock of the lance charge, the crushing impact of an armoured mass. Mongol warriors wore silk undergarments beneath their armour, not for comfort, but because silk would wrap around an arrow point rather than tear, allowing the arrow to be extracted more easily and reducing infection. Even their clothing served tactical purposes. Each Mongol warrior brought multiple horses on campaign, rotating mounts to maintain speed and endurance over distances that would exhaust European cavalry. When European heavy cavalry charged, they did so on tired horses carrying enormous weight. When Mongols engaged, they did so on fresh mounts, capable of disengaging and re-engaging at will. The strategic mobility this provided was transformative. Mongol armies could cover distances in days that European forces needed weeks to traverse. But equipment alone does not explain their dominance. The Mongols integrated combined arms warfare with a sophistication that rivaled modern military organizations. Light cavalry for harassment and pursuit, heavy cavalry for decisive strikes, siege engineers capable of reducing fortifications, and an intelligence apparatus that gathered information about enemies before campaigns even began. Mongol spies and merchants collected data on defences, political divisions, economic resources, routes of advance. How do you defend cities when the enemy has better siege weapons than you do? When they know more about your own kingdom than you do? The psychological dimension completed the package. Mongol commanders understood that reputation could win battles before they began. The calculated brutality, the stories of total annihilation for those who resisted, the offers of mercy for those who surrendered, these were not random acts of savagery, but deliberate psychological operations designed to break enemy will. And directing all of this in the European campaign stood Subutai, undefeated across 6 decades of warfare, capable of coordinating armies across mountain ranges and synchronizing attacks across hundreds of miles. European commanders learned their craft-fighting neighbours over disputed territories. Subutai had learned his conquering continents. Had the campaigns continued, this was the machine that would have ground through France, Italy and Germany. Against this force, Europe brought fragmentation masquerading as diversity. The Holy Roman Empire, that loose confederation of competing princes and bishops, could barely agree on taxation, let alone coordinate a military response to existential threat. Duke Frederick II of Austria, fresh from his minor victory against a Mongol detachment, responded to Hungary's devastation, not with aid, but by seizing Hungarian territory while Bela fled for his life. This was Europe's fundamental paradox, the political decentralization that fostered its cultural richness and economic dynamism became a fatal liability when confronting an empire that could move armies like chess pieces across a continental board. Tactically, European warfare had evolved to fight other Europeans. Heavy cavalry, the elite of feudal armies, the flower of knighthood, were magnificent in the charge and nearly useless against an enemy who refused to receive that charge. Mongol forces would scatter before the thundering approach of armoured knights, then wheel and pepper them with arrows as their exhausted horses slowed. European commanders had no framework for understanding opponents who treated warfare as a science rather than a contest of honour. Communication moved at the speed of a riding messenger, perhaps 50 miles per day on good roads in favourable conditions. By the time one kingdom learned of another's destruction, weeks had passed and the strategic situation had transformed completely. The Mongols, meanwhile, operated relay systems that could move information hundreds of miles in days. The Cuman crisis demonstrated how easily internal divisions could be weaponized. What chance did divided kingdoms have against an empire that spanned continents, when those kingdoms would tear themselves apart over suspicions and ethnic tensions even as the enemy approached? European castles, those mighty stone fortifications, represented centuries of military architecture evolving to dominate European warfare. But they had evolved to resist European siege techniques. Mongol engineers brought catapults and siege expertise refined against Chinese and Persian fortifications that made European castles look primitive by comparison. Hungary required decades to recover from what the Mongols accomplished in months. The demographic catastrophe rippled through generations. Villages that vanished and never returned, bloodlines that ended left lands without heirs, economic networks that collapsed took lifetimes to rebuild. King Bela IV, returning to his devastated kingdom, embarked on an ambitious castle-building program, authorizing the construction of stone fortifications across Hungary in a desperate attempt to ensure that if the Mongols ever returned, his people would have somewhere defensible to shelter. He had learned the lesson of 1241, though whether more castles would have stopped an enemy with superior siege technology remains questionable. The historical consensus among modern scholars is stark. Had the Mongol campaigns continued into 1242, Western Europe would likely have fallen. This is not speculation, but assessment based on the empirical record. Every military force that had faced the Mongols using conventional medieval tactics had been destroyed. The pattern was consistent from China to Hungary. Based on that track record, Paris and Rome were not merely probable targets, they were inevitable ones. Yet the Mongols never returned to Central Europe with comparable force. The Golden Horde maintained dominance over the Rus' principalities and exerted influence across the western steppes for centuries, but the era of major westward campaigns ended in 1242. The succession crisis that pulled them back also fractured the empire's unity of purpose. Later Khans had different priorities, faced different challenges, pursued different ambitions. The moment passed and did not return. Did Europe learn from its brush with annihilation? The castle building and some tactical adjustments indicated recognition that defences needed strengthening. But European warfare continued to evolve along its own trajectory, shaped primarily by conflicts between European powers rather than by the Mongol example. The coordination problems, the political fragmentation, the tactical conservatism, these persisted for centuries. These counterfactuals remain speculation, but they are speculation bounded by evidence. History's grand narratives rest on foundations far more fragile than we prefer to acknowledge. Our knowledge of these events rests on testimony written in blood and terror. Master Roger, a Hungarian cleric who survived the invasion, produced the Carmen Miserabile, the Song of Lament, an eyewitness account that stands as one of history's most harrowing documents. Roger did not write as a distant chronicler assembling second-hand reports. He wrote as a survivor describing the end of his world. His account details the chaos at Mohi, the pursuit and slaughter, the systematic devastation that followed, and his own desperate flight through a kingdom transformed into a graveyard. Reading Roger is not an exercise in historical analysis, it is bearing witness to trauma inscribed in Latin prose. Thomas of Split and other Western chroniclers added their perspectives, though most wrote from positions of relative safety, recording the catastrophe as it unfolded at a distance. Their value lies partly in what they could not explain. The confusion in their accounts mirrors the confusion of an entire civilization, confronting something beyond its conceptual framework. From the other side came different but remarkably consonant testimony. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a Franciscan friar dispatched by Pope Innocent IV on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court in 1245, returned with the Historia Mongolorum, an account of Mongol society, military practices and ambitions based on direct observation. Eastern sources including the secret history of the Mongols, Persian chronicles by Juzjani and Rashid al-Din, and Chinese records provided perspectives from within the empire itself. What emerges from comparing these sources is striking. Despite vast cultural differences and competing agendas, the basic narrative remains consistent. The Mongols invaded, they conquered with devastating efficiency, they withdrew suddenly, and the withdrawal coincided with Ögedei's death. Archaeological evidence has added physical confirmation to written testimony. Mass graves, burned settlement layers, and the demographic evidence of depopulation all corroborate what the chronicles describe. Those who survived painted pictures of unprecedented destruction, and they were not exaggerating. Let us trace the thread one final time. The Mongol Empire, having conquered from the Pacific to the Carpathians, launched a coordinated invasion of Europe in early 1241. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11th, they shattered the military power of Hungary in a single day through tactical brilliance that exposed medieval European warfare as generations behind the cutting edge of military science. For the remainder of that year, they devastated Central Europe, probed westward toward Austria and Italy, and prepared for the spring campaign that would carry them deeper into the continent. Then, in spring 1242, they withdrew, not because Europe had stopped them, but because Ögedei Khan had died in Karakorum, and Mongol succession law demanded the princes return to secure their political futures. How different would our world be if Ögedei had died even 6 months later, after the 1242 campaign had already begun? Would the Renaissance have occurred under Mongol suzerainty? Would the Reformation have emerged in a Europe transformed by conquest? The questions multiply endlessly because the variables are so profound. This was Europe's closest brush with total conquest before the 20th century. The distance from Mohi to the annihilation of Western Christendom was measured not in European resistance, but in the lifespan of a single man whose drinking problem became, inadvertently, the salvation of a civilization. History offers few starker examples of contingency overwhelming determinism. Hungary carried the trauma for generations, its demographic and economic recovery incomplete for decades. But Europe as a whole moved on with disturbing speed, absorbing the Mongol invasion into legend and myth, attributing their survival to divine favour rather than acknowledging the banal truth. They had been saved by luck and internal Mongol politics, not by anything they had accomplished. The lesson of 1241 is that civilizations rest on foundations more fragile than we imagine, that the grand narratives we construct about cultural strength or historical destiny can shatter against the reality of superior force, and that sometimes survival comes down to nothing more meaningful than being fortunate in the timing of distant events over which you have no control whatsoever. If you found this examination of history's great what-if compelling, subscribe for more explorations of the moments when human civilization hung in the balance. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think Europe would have fared if the Mongols had returned for the 1242 campaign?